There's a song I want to tell you about. It's by Fletcher, a songwriter and performer who became well known during the pansy craze. Basically, a time in the early 1930s Prohibition-era United States when queer performers had a surge in popularity due to people frequenting underground venues and the growing LGBTQ scene for alcohol and entertainment. So there was a new spotlight thrust on performers, but in the US it was still illegal to be queer. The song is called Peter Lilly Daisy, though it's also referred to as It. In the song, Bruz paints a picture of the title character who's abused and berated throughout its life. And that's the thing. The point of the song is that Bruz refers to the character as It.
Little Peter Lilly Daisy had the doctors in a whirl, for physically it certainly could vex. They simply could not tell if it were boy or girl, for the minute they'd decide, it would quickly change its sex. This unusual ability it plied with great agility. In the space of just 1 second, it would switch. And because it loved to do it, and did when no one knew it, they called it neither he nor she, but much more simply, which.
After suffering abuse from its family, Peter Lilly Daisy decides to go out on its own, embracing gender in a way that's different than what society prescribes.
Now the finish to poor It is quite apparent. It was something Hollywood found most inherent. It was taken up like mad, wrote a letter to its dad, saying nuts to you and your decisions, I'm okay here in both divisions. And it's lived there very happy ever after.
I'm sure you've already noticed something. This doesn't really translate to the modern vocabulary that's often used in English to describe queerness. Using it as a pronoun has been a political tool to dehumanize queer people, and as a result, it's not thought of as endearing. But I don't think that's related to this song. This song could easily have been a campy joke that poked fun at someone who deviated from gender roles. But it isn't. It's an overtly positive song that does have a campy lightheartedness to it, but ultimately explores the nuances of not fitting into cisgender heterosexual standards. And it's also autobiographical. At least, it seems to be. Though Bruz Fletcher went by him, he had a very tumultuous life, and the story of Peter Lilly Daisy seems to reflect that. But don't just take my word for it. Tyler Alpern, the main expert on Fletcher's life and work, has also pointed that out. I empathize with this song. Peter Lilly Daisy goes through hardship, but understanding its place in the world and its queerness isn't necessarily about overcoming adversity, but understanding queerness as its own power. And at the end, Peter Lilly Daisy hasn't just overcome the society that held it back, it's defeated it. And at its core, this is a song about not being a man, not being a woman, but being something else entirely. In our modern terms, Peter Lilly Daisy might be referred to as non-binary. According to Merriam-Webster, that means relating to or being a person who identifies with or expresses a gender identity that is neither entirely male nor entirely female. Non-binary as a term didn't come out of nowhere. People not identifying with the gender binary has been a thing for as long as the gender binary has, and throughout history there have been many different terms describing it in certain contexts. In this situation though, our modern use of non-binary came as an expansion of genderqueer, a term popularized in the 1980s to describe those who don't adhere to the gender binary. And though Merriam-Webster's definition isn't wrong, it's only a piece of what non-binary means. Non-binary can mean not entirely male and not entirely female, but it can also be a third gender option of its own. It can also be used as an adjective, as there are queer people who identify as non-binary women and men. It also encompasses words like agender that refer to those who are genderless. So it's an umbrella term. It's also played an objectively helpful role in the last 10 years of queer rights. As a word, non-binary has done a lot of the heavy lifting in getting a significant amount of mainstream media and culture to accept gender nonconforming people. And through that, it's affected how we even look at gender from a mainstream linguistic perspective. Though gender-neutral and other gendered pronouns have been around for a long time, the recent non-binary push of singular they-them pronouns has had an enormous impact, to the point where it's fully integrated into dictionaries and textbooks about the English language. Non-binary is a word that has been very important to me in the last 10 years of my life. But I need a new word. Mein Leben änderte sich, als ich nach Deutschland zog. Obwohl ich noch nie Deutsch gesprochen hatte, bevor ich nach Berlin kam, merkte ich schnell, wie sehr ich in der Stadt bleiben wollte, und deshalb habe ich die Sprache gelernt. Aber ich habe nicht nur eine neue Sprache gelernt. Ich lernte eine ganz neue Art, mich selbst zu verstehen und die Welt zu sehen. Du kannst vielleicht hören, was ich meine. Wenn ich Deutsch spreche, klingt es für mich ganz anders, als wenn ich Englisch spreche. Ich glaube, dass das Erlernen einer zweiten Sprache deine Welt in vielerlei Hinsicht öffnen kann. Sich in eine zweite Sprache auszudrücken kann befreiend sein. Man kann wählen, wie man sich ausdrückt, ohne das Gepäck der Umgebung zu haben, in der man aufgewachsen ist. Natürlich wird das Erlernen einer Sprache auch davon gebaut, von wem man sie lernt. Als ich das erste Mal nach Deutschland kam, hatte ich viele Affären mit älteren Männern mit tiefen Stimmen. Dadurch ist meine Art, Deutsch zu sprechen, tiefer und laut paar Freundinnen klingt ein Teil meines Wortschatzes wie der eines 50er- oder 60er-jährigen Mannes. Aber ich habe nicht das Gefühl, dass ich eine Rolle spiele, wenn ich Deutsch spreche. Tatsächlich fühle ich mehr wie ich selbst. Wenn ich Englisch spreche, denke ich nicht wirklich drüber nach. Aber wenn ich Deutsch spreche, kann ich so sein, wie ich bin. Deutsch ist eine Sprache mit Geschlecht. Und was ich meine, ist, dass obwohl wir im Englischen einfach the sagen, hat Deutsch 3 verschiedene Versionen. Der, die und das. Der ist maskulin, die ist feminin und das ist neutral. Als Sprache hat das Geschlecht im Deutschen nicht nur Auswirkungen auf die Grammatik. Es ist auch sozial. Obwohl es im Englischen einige Wörter gibt, die sich je nach Geschlecht ändern, zum Beispiel blond und blond, ist es im Deutschen viel häufiger, zum Beispiel Künstler und Künstlerin, Mitarbeiter und Mitarbeiterin etc. Um das zu umgehen, haben queere Aktivistinnen viele Möglichkeiten, andere Dinge zu schreiben. Künstlerin und Künstlerin sind zum Beispiel beides Möglichkeiten, geschlechtsneutral zu bezeichnen. Aber wie du hören kannst, sagt man es beim Sprache nicht anders. Es gibt auch den Begriff divers, vielfältig, der in den letzten Jahren populär geworden ist, aber obwohl es kulturell für nicht-binäre Menschen stehen kann, ist es hauptsächlich ein juristischer Begriff, der verwendet wird, um intersexuelle Menschen zu beschreiben, die nicht immer unter den Begriff trans fallen. Und die deutsche Sprache hat das gleiche Problem, das die englische Sprache mit he, she in Form von er, sie hat. Aber es gibt verschiedene Möglichkeiten, damit umzugehen. Im Deutschen gibt es ähnlich wie im Englischen Pronomen für das dritte Geschlecht, aber sie sind nicht üblich. Manche Leute haben ihre eigenen Pronomen, manche benutzen sowohl er als auch sie, manche benutzen es und manche benutzen sogar nur das englische they, them, aber keines davon ist unbedingt der Standard. Die gebräuchlichste geschlechtsneutrale Lösung scheint die Verwendung von sie für alle zu sein. Und das ist auch etwas, das im Feminismus auch außerhalb Queerness eine politische Rolle spielt. Einige nicht-binäre Menschen mögen jedoch die Verwendung von sie nicht und verwenden stattdessen er auf die gleiche Weise. Für mich, ich sage sie. Es dient ein paar verschiedene Zwecken. 1. Ich bin eine Einwanderin mit Akzent, also werden die Leute mein Deutsch korrigieren, wenn ich nicht normative Dinge benutze. Und 2. Es nimmt den Fokus von der Sprache weg. Anstatt in eine Diskussion über Linguistik zu geraten, legt es die Verantwortung der Person, mit der ich spreche, auf die Frage, wie sie mich sieht. Sie wissen bereits, wie man sie in einem Satz verwendet, also geht es nur darum, ihre begrenzten Ansichten darüber zu erweitern, wie sie aussehen können. Das ist etwas ganz anderes als das, wie ich mich im Englischen sehe. Im Englischen benutze ich they, them, weil ich mich so fühle, weil ich mich so identifiziere. Ich kenne viele Freundinnen, die aus dem gleichen Grund andere Pronomen benutzen. Aber wenn es um Deutsch geht, sage ich nicht, wer ich bin, sondern wer ich nicht bin. Und trotzdem fühle ich mich mehr wie ich selbst. When I say non-binary, I feel similar to how I use pronouns in German. I feel as though I'm not telling people who I am, but who I'm not. And that's kind of built into the name. Though non-binary means many different things for different people, the word itself literally just says not in relation to the gender binary. When I came to terms with my transness, that was the only word I had to describe my gender, but it didn't feel right. To emphasize that I viewed it as a third gender of its own, I stopped putting a hyphen in it. But that still didn't feel right. There are other words like neutrois that describe a third gender that's neutral, but I didn't feel like that applied to me. But I'm not the only one who feels this way. Non-binary is just a modern term, and like I said, there have always been people existing outside of the gender binary and describing this way of living in different ways. And as I was feeling uncomfortable with non-binary, songs like Peter, Lillie, Daisy reminded me that there are other ways of thinking about this. So I started learning. There are many cultures that have genders other than man and woman, but these identities are often tied to cultural context and heritage. The topic of cultural appropriation is a whole other discussion, but if you want to learn more about how that relates to conversations about queer identities, I'll include links in the description to resources you can check out. In 1862, Karl Heinrich Ulrichs coined the term Urning to describe himself. Put simply, this word described a man with a female psyche. There was also Urningen to describe women with male psyches. These terms were mainly used to describe who we would probably label in modern terms as homosexuals, people who feel same-gender attraction. Before I go further, I should note that the term was translated into English by John Addington Symonds as Uranian, but that became a different thing, and that's not what I'm talking about. In a modern context, Urning seems problematic for a few reasons. The idea of medicalizing queer experience, the conflation of sexuality with gender, etc. But I like this word. And anyway, what is the goal of imposing our modern vocabulary onto centuries-old texts? I understand there's some irony to me using queer to describe people from the 1800s, but as of right now, there isn't a succinct word to describe relationships, behavior, and expression that deviated from social norms over time. And it was 1862. This was a time when the popular words to describe queerness were associated with predatory behavior. In addition, words like homosexuality hadn't even been coined yet. So Urning was Ulrichs' attempt at having a way to talk about his feelings that didn't carry a stigma. By identifying it, he could talk about it. Words have power. Growing up queer in a conservative environment showed me that coming to terms with my queerness was less about understanding my feelings and more about semantics, more about stealing back the vocabulary that was withheld from me. Maybe I would have known I was gay sooner if I had been taught what gay was, aside from harmful stereotypes. In retrospect, I always was trans, but maybe I would have understood it better if I was told about non-binary earlier, allowing myself to identify the feelings I had already been feeling. By identifying it, I could talk about it. And similarly, by identifying with it, I could talk about it. I think identity as a concept is important. Recent mainstream recognition of non-binary people feels very much like a result of having standardized words that can concisely define things. And on top of that, it gives people a sense of community, something to advocate for, something to work towards. However, I've also seen the negatives of having identity be such an important prerequisite for discussion. I've seen conservative queer people advocate for things that harm the community, and their talking points gain legitimacy because they are part of the community. It's easy to label those people as not being really queer or just having internalized queer phobia, but I think doing that would ignore the history of queerness aligning with fascism and far-right movements. I think it's more important to remember that queerness is not inherently aligned with politics, and I'd much rather talk about that. Talk about how being queer is not the same thing as being a good person, and if we want to work towards a more inclusive world, part of that is understanding those nuances and not letting those people infiltrate conversations just because of their identity. Words can also fail in other contexts. When I see people say women and non-binary people, I feel othered. Like non-binary is less a term to represent a group of people and more a box that mainstream society can push us in when they don't know how to understand us. The amount of times that I've been in a room where supposed allies are tripping over their words to avoid saying something wrong is overwhelming. In general, I'd much rather have people feel empowered to speak on my behalf than not say anything out of fear of intimidation or speaking out of turn. And I think that can be done without repeating the history where vague allies have claimed to speak on behalf of the community while actually harming it. I'm tired of terms like AMAB and AFAB that are supposed to take meaning away from stereotypes about gender, but instead just repackage invasive assumptions about genitalia. And I'm tired of well-meaning people being afraid to talk about me because they don't understand what non-binary means. But who can blame them when the word itself is so nebulous? Merriam-Webster defines it concretely, but like I've said, non-binary basically means a different thing to everyone who uses it. So, what now? 2 months ago, I was crying in my husband's arms. A celebrity who I looked up to had come out as trans, triggering a visceral response in me that made me wonder if I should start transitioning. I've always dealt with gender dysphoria, but understanding how my dysphoria works has been a complicated journey for me. You see, I also deal with obsessive-compulsive disorder, and this means that I often suffer from intrusive thoughts and obsessive patterns of catastrophizing. When I came out as gay at the age of 15, I immediately started having intrusive thoughts about being bisexual. For some reason, the weight of thinking about how I lied to everyone was too much for me. I felt like I had chosen a word to describe myself, and the fact that it was more complicated than I thought was indicative of how I'm a deceitful person. I'm not bisexual, nor is there anything wrong with being bisexual, but as you can see, living with OCD affects the way I deal with queerness. Questioning myself isn't always a fruitful process. By default, my brain is questioning everything I do and tormenting me with it. Thoughts of transitioning are also entangled in my OCD. Over the years, I've learned to understand how to differentiate between my dysphoria and my OCD-based intrusive thoughts. When I question my gender, sexuality, or expression, it feels like a relieving process, like I'm putting the puzzle pieces together to understand myself. But when I have intrusive thoughts about actually being a woman and needing to transition, it doesn't feel fulfilling. I feel less like I'm realizing my true self and more subservient to these compulsions that make me too anxious to function. This is a difficult thing to articulate. I haven't said anything like this before because of how I worry people might perceive it. When I've brought it up with other queer friends, they are well-intentioned, but often assume that the ways in which my mental illness manifests are actually just symptoms of internalized transphobia. I don't think that's out of the question, but living with OCD as a non-binary queer person is difficult, and as I've learned over the years, I'm not the only person dealing with this. For me, dysphoria can be physical, but it feels mostly contextual. When I have sex, sometimes I feel more masculine, other times I feel more feminine. When I see a handsome man, I want him to see my femininity. But when I go outside, I like being masculine. When I sing, I feel at ease with my voice. I like how it can be sultry and deep, but also be delicate and wispy. It's moments like those that remind me that I don't want to transition. In fact, I feel comfortable about my body. When I feel dysphoria, it feels more like I'm overwhelming myself with intrusive thoughts about how others view me. But that could all change. For me, coming to terms with uncertainty is not only part of the therapy I go through for OCD, but it's also a helpful tool for dealing with my gender. I don't feel like a man or a woman. I feel like something else entirely. So I say non-binary, but I don't know if I feel non-binary. That word is just a placeholder, an approximation. I need a new word.
Then its father took it well in hand. "My child," he said, "you now must understand. More of this I'll not allow. Are you bull or are you cow? Either in or out you go, it's a royal command." Poor little Peter Lily Daisy. What a hell of a problem it had. It requires an awful bender to decide a loss of gender. I'll be back inside a year, it told its dad.
I often listen to Peter Lily Daisy and am reminded of how my life has been, but also how it can be.
When it got to France, it appeared in pants. But the French were bored with sights like that and fled. So it wandered on to the Parthenon. But to save its life in Greece, it changed in bed.
Music is powerful because it can communicate things that are difficult to describe. When I sing, I feel like I communicate all I need to say about my gender. The way I express myself feels so apparent, so real and immediate. And then how I speak differs depending on the language and circumstance. For me, it's so easy to see how words are helpful, but they're just placeholders for feelings. They're an attempt to communicate things that are so individual and subjective that it makes sense that they can't carry objective truth. They're reference points that we use to help others know how we're feeling. And that's how I feel about non-binary. For me, it's a placeholder until I find a word that I think describes myself better. But at the moment, it doesn't describe who I am, but who I'm not. So I need a new word. But I don't think that will come right away. I think expecting to find another word and be done with it would be missing the point. I think the problem with non-binary is that it's unclear. It's another umbrella term that gets lost in translation. But the same could be said about literally any of the mainstream words to describe gender, sexuality, and types of queerness that are ultimately more complex than language is able to represent. And for many non-binary people, it is perfectly clear. I feel the way I feel, but that's just my perspective. I need a new word. But more importantly, I need a new world. I don't think the term non-binary needs to be thrown out. It's such an important word for so many people, and it occupies a crucial place in modern-day queer rights. But I think it's a shame that I can have conversations with other trans friends in which we use 10 different gender-neutral pronouns interchangeably, only to have to consolidate that into they-them to make it digestible to others. I need a world where we can understand how words can be both helpful and limiting. Where people who feel represented by words can take solace in them, but those who feel differently can have a space to articulate that without being placed in a generic other category. And maybe starting that discussion requires wondering why we try to standardize queerness through words in the first place. Things like neopronouns show what a more inclusive world can look like. One that standardizes the idea of everyone having a unique and individual relationship to language. Because ultimately, everyone should have a say in who they are.
Now the finish to poor it is quite apparent. It was something Hollywood found most inherent. It was taken up like mad, wrote a letter to its dad, saying nuts to you and your decisions. I'm okay here in both divisions. And it's lived there very happy ever after.